The World Cup final is upon us. From 206 teams in qualifying and 32 at the finals, 865 qualifiers and 63 games at the World Cup finals, and 4 whole years of preparations, or 4.5 in the case of this World Cup, and it all comes down to this. A game in which legendary status can be won or lost, entire nations can be healed or wounded, and where legacies are so often defined. The biggest event in all of world sport. Or is it? Well, in today's video, that's what I wanted to try and examine. There is no doubt that football is the biggest sport in the world, by almost any measure, whether that be viewership, registered players, or solely in financial terms, and the World Cup final is therefore the pinnacle of the world's most popular sport. But does that make it the world's biggest sporting event? What other factors might we take into account? And maybe it isn't purely a numbers game at all. And if the World Cup final isn't the biggest event in all of world sport, then what is? The 100 metres at the Olympics? The Super Bowl? The Papa John's Trophy final? Alright, it's probably not the Papa John's Trophy final. Sorry, Rotherham. But anyway, that is what this video is all about, and I promise you, from the bottom of my heart, that the Millers will not catch any more strays from this point onwards. The Papa John's Deep Crust Cheesy Base Trophy isn't the only sporting competition or event that gets immediately banished from consideration, since in truth, the Summer Olympics is the only sporting competition or event that can rival the FIFA World Cup by most metrics, and at a stretch, the Cricket World Cup as well. Of course, there are individual metrics by which almost every sporting event exceeds the World Cup, at least to some extent. I recently read an article extolling the virtues of the Tour de France in comparison with the World Cup, which pointed out, or at least claimed, I haven't done the necessary research to either confirm nor deny it, that whilst the average footballer only plays 5.6 minutes of football per day throughout the duration of the World Cup, the average racer at the Tour de France spends 3 hours, 28 minutes, and 18 seconds a day on their bikes. Now, don't get me wrong, I have a lot of respect for cyclists, and the Tour de France is an absolutely grueling physical feat, and it can't be easy spending 23 days in a row juiced up to the eyeballs on roids, but that doesn't strike me as necessarily being the best basis upon which to build a claim that the Tour de France is a greater sporting event than the World Cup, or at least not a winning one. That it is more physically demanding, perhaps, and that there is less rest and recuperation in between competition, most certainly, but greater overall just because of that? I'm not convinced. Similarly, I have seen it claimed that because Formula 1 is more lucrative than the World Cup, with the Formula 1 calendar said to be worth $2 billion more than the World Cup. Again, I haven't checked any of these facts, whether they are true or not in this instance is largely irrelevant, and that F1 has outearned FIFA every year since 1999, that means that Formula 1 is either bigger or better than the FIFA World Cup. The obvious caveat to that, to begin with, is that the Formula 1 season is 8 months long, with a 1-month break in the middle. Meanwhile, the World Cup lasts only a single month, or, in the case of this World Cup, even less than a month, just 29 days. A better comparison financially with Formula 1 would be the Premier League then, though even that doesn't quite work given that the Premier League is, ostensibly at least, still a domestic football league, whilst Formula 1 is the highest class of international racing, and is therefore global by its very definition. Aside from that though, supposing Formula 1 really was more lucrative or profitable than the World Cup, even on a per-day basis or by any other measure, so what? Would that really make it a greater sporting event in any meaningful sense? The Super Bowl is the most lucrative single-day sporting event on Earth, despite only being enormously popular in one country, by virtue of its rampant commercialization and the fact that the United States is the richest country in the world, and the Super Bowl has become a de facto national holiday there. In fact, the Super Bowl is reported to be almost twice as lucrative as any other single-day sporting event. Meanwhile, when it comes to prize money, the World Cup is left in the dust and dwarfed by both Formula 1 and the UEFA Champions League. The UEFA Champions League pays out the most prize money of any of the world's sporting events, around $1.3 billion a season, but does that therefore mean that it is a greater sporting event than either Formula 1 or the World Cup? It all seems rather arbitrary. After all, the most lucrative game in all of world sport, and certainly within the world of football, far outstripping the Champions League or World Cup finals, is actually the Championship playoff final, with victory at Wembley over 90 minutes and therefore promotion to the Premier League being worth a guaranteed £170 million, which is almost exactly double what the winners of the Champions League get. Is the Championship playoff final then, which is a battle to determine the third team to win promotion from the second tier of English football to the first, a greater sporting event than the game which crowns the best club side in Europe or the best national team in the world? As a Hull City fan, unlikely to see my team ever win the Champions League, and certain not to see England win the World Cup for at least another 4 years now, but having witnessed 2 Championship playoff final successes, I might be inclined to suggest that it is. But I doubt many other people would be convinced. Trying to measure everything in pounds and dollar signs, whilst it may be the way of the world, and indeed the way of football when you look at the direction in which the game has gone, where the last 2 World Cups have been held and why they were held there, supporters by and large are still able to see beyond that. The same is true of players. Financially, they would be far better remunerated by winning the Champions League than the World Cup, or even just pretty much any domestic trophy, but you would be hard-pushed to find many players who wouldn't swap any trophy in the game that they had ever won for a World Cup winner's medal. By the same token, it is probably true, as it is so often claimed, that the standard of football in the UEFA Champions League, and particularly in the latter stages, is higher than at the World Cup. In the club game, the biggest and richest clubs are able to monopolise talent and build super teams, unlike in the international game, where talent tends to be more spread out. But it is because of that very fact that international football still retains a sense of romance and magic that has been continually eroded from club football. There are far more shocks and upsets, for example, at almost every World Cup than there are in a handful of seasons of the Champions League. That is partly due to the truncated format. Teams only play each other once in the group stage rather than twice, and over a very short period of time, and every knockout tie is just a single game at a neutral venue, rather than a home and away leg, as is the case in the Champions League. You might recall, actually, that the 2019-20 Champions League, from the quarter-final stage onwards, did follow the same format as the World Cup due to COVID, with all ties being single-legged and all played on neutral ground in the Portuguese capital of Lisbon. It is no surprise, therefore, that the 2019-20 quarter-finals saw massively atypical Champions League upsets, such as RB Leipzig beating Atletico Madrid 2-1, Lyon knocking Manchester City out in a 3-1 win, and of course, Bayern Munich beating Barcelona 8-2, which wasn't a shock so much in terms of the result, but was pretty shocking when it came to the scoreline. There were some calls at the time to reintroduce the single-legged format for the Champions League, with the quarter-finals having been so entertaining, especially for a whole generation of football fans, too young to remember the European Cup, having followed the same format. But they never stood a chance. UEFA wants more and more games, not less, constantly, as we are about to see with the newly revamped Champions League format, because it means that they generate more cash. In that sense, income, revenue, and profit are all things that often serve to lessen the greatness of a sporting competition, so the idea that they alone can determine what is the greatest sporting event seems not only arbitrary and without basis to me, but, if anything, actually quite counterintuitive. The same can be said, I suppose, for television viewing figures. It is possible, theoretically, that another sporting event could have more viewers than a World Cup final, and you could argue that it has already happened. The opening ceremony of the 2008 Olympics in China is the most viewed event of any description in the history of television, and almost certainly the only single event ever to have had a peak audience in excess of 1 billion people. On the subject of viewing figures, it is actually quite complicated since most of the figures that get quoted are circulated either by partisans or event organisers themselves, either based on spurious claims and extrapolations or just entirely made up. Whether it be royal weddings or funerals supposedly witnessed by about 4 times the global population if you believe the British tabloid press, 1 billion people supposedly having tuned in for the Super Bowl, or, hilariously, 1.5 billion people apparently having watched the Commonwealth Games, chances are, whatever record TV viewing figure you have ever read about in a newspaper, seen on social media, or heard quoted on television, they are probably nonsense. There are official organisations, whilst imperfect, who do at least attempt to gauge TV audiences with a relative degree of accuracy, and thanks to them we know that typically around 250 to 500 million people have watched the last 7 or 8 World Cup finals, not, surprisingly enough, 1.12 billion people as FIFA claimed in 2018, presumably using a counting that was so dodgy that even Sepp Blatter told them to rein it in a bit. FIFA also claimed, spuriously, that more than half of the world watched the 2018 World Cup, claiming a global audience of 3.572 billion people. That figure is, of course, undiluted horse urine, roundly debunked not only by the people who actually monitor these things, but automatically by anyone who just stops for a minute to think about these things, the demographics of the planet, access to television and the internet, kickoff times, and so on and so forth, but I digress. The point being that the World Cup final is the most watched sporting event unless you count the opening ceremony of the 2008 Olympics, which is a sports-related or sports-adjacent event, but you would be hard-pushed to call it a sporting event outright, I think, given that there is no actual sport or competition taking place. If you were happy to call it a sporting event, though, and, well, who am I to stop you then? Largely by virtue of the 2008 Olympics being held in China, the most populous country on Earth, home to more than 1.4 billion people, and so many Chinese people having watched it, then, yes, it is the most viewed sporting event of all time. Outside of China, the 2008 Olympic opening ceremony wasn't watched by as many people as any recent World Cup final. Here in the United Kingdom, for example, it was watched by just 5 million people, which is around the same as the audience for some FA Cup third-round ties broadcast live on the BBC. The same is true of the most watched sporting event outside of the Olympics and the World Cup, which was the final of the 2011 Cricket World Cup between the co-hosts India and Sri Lanka. That drew a claimed viewership of 558 million people, and a likely actual audience that was probably about a third of that. The vast majority of viewers, some 135 million in total, were in India, the second most populous nation on Earth behind China, which also happens to be pretty passionate about cricket. Just as with China and the 2008 Olympics ceremony, outside of India, viewership was nowhere near that of a FIFA World Cup final. Just 635,000 people tuned in from the United Kingdom, a country which is quite keen on cricket, which is fewer than the number of people here who watched a Premier League game between Fulham and Blackpool over the exact same weekend. Ultimately, that is what differentiates the World Cup, and by extension of that, the World Cup final, from all other sporting events, including even the Olympics. It is truly global. Although almost every nation is represented at a Summer Olympics, interest in the Games tends to be fairly limited in South America and in large parts of Southeast Asia. The Cricket World Cup ranges from reasonably to immensely popular throughout the Commonwealth, that is, basically a nice way of saying countries that were colonised by Britain, for those of you who might be unaware, but there is next to no interest in it outside of Britain's former colonies. And the Super Bowl may reign supreme in the US of A, but for all of its glitz, glamour, and commercial appeal, even Snoop Dogg, Katy Perry, and Coldplay cannot seem to attract all that much interest outside of the United States. So, what is a uniquely American festival continues to have a very American audience. Of course, the degree of interest in the FIFA World Cup varies from country to country and territory to territory, depending on factors such as whether the country in question has qualified and how far they go at that specific tournament, and there are some countries where football isn't as ubiquitous, but in terms of its global reach, it is still without peer. Not only do people from every corner of the globe watch the World Cup though, they actually attend it. Anyone who has attended a World Cup or Olympic Games, or just been in a country whilst it is hosting those events, will know that there is a very different feel about them. Of course, there are people who travel far and wide to witness the Olympics, but nowhere near in the same number, or from as far afield, as the World Cup. And that includes countries that don't even qualify. For all of its faults, and boy, they are many, this World Cup has been a great illustration of that fact, with large numbers of football fans from India, Bangladesh, and other South Asian countries who can afford the privilege having attended, along with tens of thousands more making the short journey to Qatar from Western Asia and North Africa. Often, due to the way in which the World Cup ticketing system works, these fans will pick a team to follow since their own country failed to qualify for the World Cup, and attend all of their games until they are eliminated. I know someone from the Maldives who did just that at this World Cup, for Spain in his case, so he perhaps didn't end up staying for as long as he might have hoped, but anyway, I digress. None of this is unique to Qatar though, it is the same at every World Cup. Whereas the majority of people who attend virtually every Olympic event are locals, that is to say, they are citizens of the country in which that Olympics is being held, Russians accounted for just 871,797 of the 2.4 million tickets sold by FIFA at the 2018 FIFA World Cup. The rest were all foreigners, quite literally coming from all over the world. It is possible, albeit unlikely, that a Cricket World Cup final between India and Pakistan could draw a television audience greater than the final of the FIFA World Cup, but that audience would be almost exclusively, and we are talking well in excess of 90%, made up of viewers solely from the two countries involved. Would that higher total number of viewers nonetheless mean that the Cricket World Cup final, in this hypothetical scenario, had become a bigger event than the FIFA World Cup final? Maybe it would, but I'm not so convinced. After all, a World Cup semi-final, let's just say between India and China, supposing both nations made pretty enormous strides in the sport here, would draw a far larger television audience than a World Cup final between, say, Uruguay and Croatia. But would one of the two World Cup semi-finals then have overtaken the World Cup final as the biggest event in sport? When you frame it like that, it sounds obviously absurd. Of course it wouldn't. In case you were still in any doubt as to the World Cup's global reach, it is worth noting that of FIFA's 14 partners and principal sponsors at this World Cup, 4 of them are Chinese companies, despite China not being at this World Cup, and only ever having qualified once in 2002, when they lost all 3 games, and they have spent over $1.4 billion sponsoring the tournament, and another of those 14 companies is the Indian company Byju's, despite India also not being at this World Cup, and never having even appeared at any World Cup finals. Ultimately then, the World Cup final is the biggest event at the biggest tournament in the world's biggest sport. There is a reason why the Rugby World Cup is known as the Rugby World Cup, and the Cricket World Cup is known as the Cricket World Cup. Meanwhile, the FIFA World Cup is simply referred to as the World Cup, not the Football World Cup, since its presence and influence is so pervasive and inescapable. Not only is the World Cup the biggest event in world sport, it is growing faster and spreading wider than any other comparable sporting event. As football's reach extends ever further, somehow seemingly not yet having saturated the global market, the World Cup hoovers up that added interest, maintaining an endless unpredictability, unlike a lot of other sports, and indeed, even club football. The amount of upsets and drama at this and practically all World Cups is unparalleled these days in the major leagues or Champions League, where financial might reign supreme and few can compete with the established super clubs and/or those owned by states or state-affiliated oligarchs. It is only the further financialization of the international game and of the World Cup that threatens to undermine the unpredictability and excitement that is key to the World Cup's enduring appeal, illustrated by ill-thought-out format changes and expansions planned for the next World Cup in 2026 for solely economic reasons. But for now, yes, the FIFA World Cup final is undoubtedly the biggest event in world sport. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it. If that was the case, then why not hit the like button? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for HITC Sevens. You can also find me, personally, on either Twitter or on Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.